The letter was folded 3 times, the paper soft and worn at the creases as though it had been opened and closed 1,000 times before. Sallie Rhodes held it in her hands and did not read it yet. She looked at Cecil Thatcher instead, at the man who had ridden hard for 2 days without sleep, whose dark eyes were red-rimmed and hollow with exhaustion, whose jaw was set like iron even as his hands trembled slightly when he held the paper out to her. "Read it," he said. "Before I walk into that sheriff's office, I need one person in this world to know the truth of things. Just one." And somehow, he exhaled through his nose, something between a laugh and a wound. "It ended up being you." Sallie stared at him. The morning wind cut through Copper Falls, Nevada, sharp and dry, carrying red dust off the desert flats east of town. It was 1883. The street behind them was quiet at this hour, not yet 6 in the morning, and the sheriff's office sat 30 yards away like a jaw waiting to close. Cecil Thatcher wanted in 3 territories, bounty at $900, accused of robbing the Southern Pacific Railroad twice, and murdering a federal marshal near Reno, stood in front of her like a man who had already made peace with dying. She took the letter. She read the first line and her breath stopped. She read the second line and something cracked open behind her sternum, deep and irreversible. By the time she reached the bottom of the page, her hand was shaking, not from fear, from fury, from the specific, devastating kind of fury that comes from learning that the world has told an enormous, cruel lie for a very long time, and someone innocent has been carrying the weight of it on his back alone, without anyone ever thinking to ask the right questions. Sallie Rhodes folded the letter precisely the way she had found it. She tucked it into the breast pocket of her riding coat. Then she looked at Cecil Thatcher with eyes that had gone from amber to something closer to fire, and she said 4 words that neither of them had expected to come out of her mouth. "Saddle your horse again." He stared at her. "What?" "You heard me, Cecil Thatcher. You are not walking into that office. Not yet. Not until I have ridden to Elko and come back with what that letter says needs to be found. You give me 3 days. "Sallie, 3 days," she said. "Or I will walk in there myself and read that letter aloud in front of the whole town, and let every person in Copper Falls decide what they think of the man they've been calling a murderer." The silence between them stretched like a wire pulled tight. Then Cecil Thatcher, the outlaw, the fugitive, the man who had not let himself be surprised by anything in 6 years of running, looked at this woman he had known for exactly 11 days and felt something in his chest collapse and rebuild itself simultaneously. "Why?" he whispered. Sallie was already moving toward the livery stable. "Because the letter is true," she called back without turning around. "And I can prove it. Now stop standing there and ride with me or stay behind. Either way, I am going." He stared after her for one full breath. Then he grabbed the reins of his horse and rode with her. To understand how Sallie Rhodes came to be standing in the pre-dawn dust of Copper Falls, holding the most consequential letter in Cecil Thatcher's life, you have to go back 11 days, to a morning when a broken wheel and a stubborn mule changed the course of 2 people's lives, in a way that neither fate nor logic could have arranged better on purpose. Sallie had been driving her survey wagon alone along the northeastern rim of the Humboldt Sink, which in September of 1883 was a cracked white expanse of alkali flat that shimmered in the heat like a mirage of itself. She had been contracted by the Nevada State Land Office to survey the boundary lines of 7 contested parcels near the Elko-Lander County border, a job that most men in the survey business turned down because the terrain was brutal, the water scarce, and the landowners who were disputing the parcels were known to be the kind of men who expressed their displeasure with a rifle rather than a formal complaint. Sallie had taken the contract because she was the best land surveyor west of Salt Lake City, and she knew it, and the money was good, and she had never in her 26 years of life allowed the fact that she was a woman to stand between herself and work she was qualified to do. She carried with her a Gurley Transit theodolite, the finest surveying instrument available in 1883, along with a full set of surveying chains, a compass set, field notebooks filled with her own highly precise notation system, and a Winchester Model 1873 rifle for the rattlesnakes, of which there were many on the Humboldt sink. The wheel on her survey wagon had cracked at the spoke 3 miles east of where a man sat unconscious under a juniper tree. She had gotten down, assessed the damage with the calm pragmatism she applied to every problem, and was in the process of calculating how long it would take to walk back to the nearest settlement when she noticed the horse first, a blue roan gelding tied to the juniper's lowest branch, and then the man slumped beneath it. Her hand went to her Winchester immediately. She approached carefully. The man was breathing, which resolved one category of concern, but he had a wound on his left side that had bled through his shirt and dried in a wide rust-colored stain, and his skin had the gray, papery look of someone who had lost too much blood and not enough water. Sallie Rhodes was not a nurse. She was a land surveyor, but she had spent 6 years working alone in remote terrain, which meant she had accumulated, out of sheer necessity, a practical knowledge of emergency wound care, water sourcing, and the basic treatment of shock. She set down her rifle. She uncapped her canteen, and she got to work. It took him 4 hours to regain full consciousness. When he did, he found himself propped against the juniper tree with his wound cleaned and wrapped in strips cut from what had apparently been a perfectly good cotton surveying flag, a canteen within reach of his hand, and a woman he had never seen before sitting 6 feet away from him eating a piece of hardtack and writing in a field notebook without looking up. "You're awake," she said, still not looking up. Where his voice cracked, she held the canteen toward him without comment. He drank. "Who are you?" "Sallie Rhodes. I survey land for the state of Nevada." She turned a page. "You're Cecil Thatcher." His whole body went rigid. His eyes cut to where she had set his saddlebags. "How do you? Your name is on the wanted notice that fell out of your coat pocket when I was checking your breathing," she said mildly. $900. Southern Pacific Railroad and a dead marshal named Prentice Holt near Reno. She looked up at him then, and her amber eyes were steady and completely unimpressed by the information. "I am not going to collect it. I needed you alive because I needed your horse. My wagon wheel is broken, and I have 4 more survey parcels to complete by October 1st. I will trade you your canteen and the medical care I have already provided in exchange for the use of your horse for 3 days, at which point I will return it to you wherever you would like to meet." Cecil stared at her with an expression that suggested his brain was trying to catch up to a situation that had outpaced his available categories entirely. "You are," he started. "Negotiating," she said. "Do you have a counteroffer?" He did not. He was also, he discovered when he tried to stand, not in any condition to be making counteroffers. The wound in his side had gone deeper than it felt, and his legs had the reliability of wet paper. "Rest," Sallie said. "I will set up camp. We can discuss logistics in the morning." And that was how it began, not with romance, not with lightning and fate, but with a broken wheel, a wounded fugitive, and a woman who looked at a $900 wanted notice and performed a rapid cost-benefit analysis that favored keeping the outlaw breathing. She was not naive about who he was. She was not soft about it. On the second night, when they had made camp in a dry creek bed and the stars over the Nevada desert were so thick they looked like salt spilled on black cloth, Cecil had asked her directly, "Doesn't it bother you, traveling with a wanted man?" Sallie had been cleaning her theodolite with a soft cloth, which she did each evening with the same focused care some people gave to prayer. She looked up at him with that steady amber gaze. "I have been refused contracts, had my survey work questioned and redone by men whose calculations turned out to be wrong and mine turned out to be right, and been told twice by county officials that a woman has no business holding a government survey license. The federal government's opinion about who is and is not a criminal is not something I have been trained to treat as gospel." Cecil had stared at her for a long moment. "That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of my character." "I haven't formed an opinion of your character yet," she said, and went back to cleaning the theodolite. "I'll tell you when I have." He had laughed at that. A real laugh, the kind that had not come out of him in so long that it felt foreign in his chest, like a word in a language he had forgotten he spoke. On the third day he was well enough to ride, and she put him to work. Not as a surveyor, though she explained the process to him with a lucidity and depth that he found unexpectedly fascinating, but as a chain man, walking the survey lines with the measuring chain while she worked the transit from the instrument station, calling out angles and elevations in a voice as precise and unwavering as a clock. He had watched her set up the theodolite on its tripod and level it with small, confident adjustments, then sight through the telescope toward the distant ranging rod he had planted on her instruction, and call out the horizontal angle to within 10 seconds of arc. He had watched her compute bearing corrections in her head faster than he could have managed with paper and pencil. He had watched her read the landscape, the dips and rises of terrain that looked random to him, and understand it the way a cattleman reads cattle, the way a tracker reads ground. She saw the land as information. She translated it into numbers and then into truth, fixed and permanent and legally binding. On the evening of the fourth day, after she had completed her observations for the second contested parcel and was sitting by the fire updating her field notes, he said, "How did you come to do this?" Sallie did not look up from her notebook. "My father was a surveyor. He taught me from the time I was 8 years old. When he died in 1876, I completed the survey contract he was working on, submitted it to the land office under his name because I knew they would not accept it under mine, and the calculations were correct to within 3 links of chain on every boundary line. After that, they had a difficult time justifying refusing me a license." 3 links, Cecil repeated, because the confidence in those words had come out of her so cleanly that he wanted to examine them. Out of how many chains? 48 chains per parcel, 3 parcels in that contract. She made a precise notation. The allowable error for government survey work is 8 links per parcel. I was working at less than 1 link per parcel. Cecil Thatcher was a man who had grown up riding horses and reading weather and judging the distance a sound would carry over open ground at night. He understood excellence in physical skills. He understood precision in the kind of knowledge that kept a man alive in open country. But he had not, in his 31 years on this earth, encountered a woman who wore her particular form of genius the way Sallie Rhodes wore hers, not as a performance or an argument, but simply as a fact of her existence, the way a mountain range is simply where it is. He was impressed. He was startled by his own degree of impression. And then, because he was not a man who had gotten where he was by being slow to recognize important things, he was aware that he was looking at her differently than he had 4 days ago. He looked away. He was a wanted man. He had no business looking at anyone with the kind of eyes he was currently deploying. On the 5th day, they were working the 3rd parcel when 3 riders appeared on the ridge to the north. They had the deliberate, unhurried approach of men who had been watching for a while before they chose to descend, which was never a good sign. Sallie did not stop working. She called out an observation angle to Cecil, who was holding the ranging rod at the far corner, and wrote it down. "You see them," Cecil said quietly when he returned to the instrument station with the rod. "I see them," she said, without looking up from the theodolite. "How many?" 3. "The one in the middle is wearing a red bandana. The one on the left has a cavalry rifle." "That would be Dex Stanhope," Sallie said. "He has been contesting the northern boundary of Parcel 4 since April. He has sent 2 letters to the land office claiming the 1879 survey was fraudulent. He is not going to be happy to see me out here measuring it again." She made another notation. "Stand between me and them for a moment. I need to finish this angle." Cecil moved between her and the approaching riders with an ease that suggested this was not the first time he had stood between something dangerous and something worth protecting. He rested his right hand near his holster, not on it, and waited. The three riders came to a stop 15 feet away. The man in the red bandana, Dex Stanhope, as described, was broad-faced and sunburned, with the kind of permanent squint that comes from spending decades outdoors and the kind of permanent hostility that comes from spending decades getting what you want. "That's state survey equipment," he said, looking at the theodolite. Then his eyes went to Sallie, and his expression compressed into something contemptuous. "Who authorized a woman to be out here running a survey? Nevada State Land Office Contract number 188347, Sallie said, putting the cap on her telescope lens. She straightened up and looked at Stanhope with the same calm she brought to everything. "I have the documentation in my saddlebag if you'd like to examine it." "I don't want to examine your papers. I want you off this parcel." He shifted in his saddle. "I've got a legal challenge filed in Elko. No survey should be happening until that challenge is resolved." "Your challenge was reviewed and dismissed on the 14th of August, Sallie said. "You would have received the notice by now if you retrieve your mail regularly." She picked up her field notebook. "I have 2 more observation stations to complete on this parcel today. I would prefer to do that without incident." Stanhope's jaw worked. He looked at Cecil, who had not said a word and had not moved. There was something in the way Cecil Thatcher stood, the specific, unhurried quality of a man who was very dangerous and very aware of the fact, that recalibrated most people's calculations without a word being spoken. Stanhope looked back at Sallie. "This isn't over," he said. "It's already over," Sallie replied. "The boundary line is where the law says it is, and the survey will confirm that. Good afternoon, Mr. Stanhope." The 3 riders left. Cecil watched them go until they were over the ridge and out of sight. Then he turned to find Sallie already back at the theodolite, adjusting the leveling screws for the next station. "You're not shaken by that at all," he said. "It was not quite a question. Men like Stanhope have been trying to intimidate me out of doing my job for 6 years, she said. "He is not particularly inventive about it. Set the rod at the next corner, please. I want to finish before the light changes." Cecil took the ranging rod and walked toward the next corner. He was aware, in a way that was becoming difficult to set aside, that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. Not the confrontation, which had been resolved with words and composure, but the person who had resolved it. The stillness of her. The absolute, undiluted certainty of her own competence. The way she looked at the world as a series of problems to be solved precisely, and solved them, and did not require anyone's applause or permission to do so. That evening, sitting by the fire, he told her the truth about the railroad. Not all of it, just enough. "I didn't kill Prentice Holt," he said. Sallie was writing in her notebook. She did not look up. "I know," he paused. "How?" "You have not behaved like a man who has killed a federal marshal," she said. "You have behaved like a man carrying a specific and particular guilt that has nothing to do with violence. Those are different things." He was quiet for a while. The fire crackled and sent sparks up into the desert dark. "My brother killed Holt," he said finally. "My younger brother, Jesse. He was 20 years old. He made a bad choice with the wrong people, and it ended in a dead marshal and Jesse dying himself 6 hours later in a barn outside Reno." He paused. "I was there. I arrived too late to stop it, but I was there, which was enough for the witnesses to put my face on a wanted notice." Sallie looked up from her notebook. Her eyes were steady, unblinking. "And the railroad robberies. One of them I was a part of," he said. "The first one in 1880, I needed money and I made a wrong choice. The second one," he shook his head. "That was 3 men using my name and description. It happened 6 months after the first one. I was in Colorado. That can be proven. If anyone was willing to look," he said. "Nobody has been." Sallie held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to her notebook. "Where did the story start?" she asked. "The real one, the one where it all began." And he told her. He told her about his father's ranch in the Carson Valley, which had been seized by a land company with connections to the Nevada state government in 1877, through a process that he had been too young and too inexperienced at the time to fight legally. He told her about the sheriff at the time who had been paid to look the other way. He told her about the slow, grinding ruin of his family. His mother's death in 1878, which he attributed partly to the loss of the ranch and the life they had known. His brother Jesse's turn toward anger and recklessness. His own first bad decision in 1880, made from a place of desperation he was not proud of but could not pretend away. Sallie listened without comment. She had closed her notebook by the time he finished. "Is there evidence," she asked, "of any of it? The land seizure, the false witness about Holt, the second robbery's true perpetrators?" "I have a letter," he said, "written by the man who organized the land seizure. His name was Calloway, Emmett Calloway. He died in 1881, but before he died he apparently wrote to someone, I think it was his own lawyer, a man named Devereaux in Elko, and he told the truth of it. The letter explains everything. How the land was taken, who bribed whom, and what happened the night Holt died and who actually fired the shot." He stared into the fire. "I have been carrying that letter for 4 months. I got it from Calloway's daughter, who found it in his desk after his death and thought someone should know." He paused. "I don't know if it's enough, but it's what I have." "Have you shown it to anyone?" "No one I could trust to not use it against me instead of for me." Sallie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "May I see it?" He had looked at her across the fire with the careful, guarded eyes of a man who had been out in the world alone long enough to know that trust was a thing you built slowly or lost everything. Then he had slowly reached into his coat and removed the letter and held it out to her. She had read it that night by firelight, holding it close, reading slowly and carefully the way she read everything that mattered. When she finished, she folded it back along its creases and handed it back to him. "The lawyer," she said, "Devereaux in Elko, is he still practicing?" "I believe so." "Then this letter, combined with what he likely has in his records, could be enough," she said. "Calloway's letter references 2 other witnesses. A surveyor named Webb, who I know, he lives in Reno, and a rancher named Folsom, who I believe is still in the Carson Valley." She paused. "This could be unraveled. It would take time and the right approach, but the foundation is there." Cecil stared at her. "You're talking about building a legal case." "I'm talking about establishing facts," she said, "which is what I do for a living." He had not said anything else that night, but something had shifted between them, not dramatized, not announced, just a quiet alteration in the landscape of things. The way a survey line drawn on paper suddenly fixes what was previously uncertain. Over the next 6 days, as Sallie completed the remaining survey parcels, they traveled and worked and talked in the long evenings, and Cecil Thatcher fell in love with Sallie Rhodes in the way that serious, careful people fall in love, not all at once, not in a thunderclap, but in accumulation. In the specific quality of her attention when he spoke, in the way she solved problems, in the stubborn, incandescent courage she displayed not with drama but with simple, consistent refusal to be anything other than exactly who she was, in the way she laughed, which was not often, but when it happened it was sudden and real and lit her whole face, in the way she had cleaned his wound without flinching and then offered him a negotiation instead of a surrender. He had not planned to feel any of this. He had, in fact, worked fairly hard in the last 6 years to stop himself from feeling much of anything, because feeling things when you are a fugitive is a luxury that costs more than you can pay. But Sallie Rhodes had circumvented that defense system with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. She had not tried to charm him or soften him or reach him through his vulnerability. She had simply existed, fully and brilliantly, in his vicinity, and that had been enough. He had not told her. He was an outlaw with no future, and a $900 price on his head. He kept what he felt to himself, a discipline that had cost him significantly, but that he held to because telling Sallie Rhodes he was falling in love with her, in their current circumstances, would have been the most selfish thing he could do. On the 10th day, they had ridden into Copper Falls together, which was the nearest town with a telegraph office, because Sallie needed to send her completed survey reports to the land office in Carson City. While they were in town, A man at the general store had recognized Cecil's face from a wanted notice posted to the doorframe. Within an hour, there were 2 deputies watching the street. Cecil had come to find Sallie at the telegraph office. He had stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his face set in that particular way that meant he had made a decision he did not entirely want to have made, and he had said, "I'm going to turn myself in." Sallie had looked up from the telegraph form she was composing. "To the Copper Falls sheriff. He'll hold me until they can transport me to Reno for trial." He paused. "It's probably time. I am tired of running." She had looked at him for a long, still moment. "What about the letter? I'll take it with me. Maybe it'll matter to someone. Maybe it won't." He had said this in the tone of a man who had made his peace with the worst-case version of most things. Something in Sallie's expression had shifted. It was subtle. She was not a woman who telegraphed her feelings broadly, but it was there, a kind of internal rearrangement that happened behind her amber eyes. "I want to read it again," she said. "Before you go in, let me read it once more." He had given her the letter without question. And she had read it there on the pre-dawn street of Copper Falls, in the early September light, while the sheriff's office sat 30 yards away, and Cecil Thatcher stood watching her with the look of a man already saying goodbye to something. And she had read the second line and stopped breathing. Because the second line of Emmett Calloway's letter contained a name she recognized not in a casual way, but in the specific, documented, professionally significant way that a land surveyor recognizes a name that appears in the contested survey records of 1879. The name was Harlan Webb, not Webb the witness, Webb the surveyor. The same surveyor whose 1879 survey of the Carson Valley parcels, the parcels that had belonged to Cecil's father, the parcels that had been seized, had contained an error. An error Sallie had identified last spring while reviewing historical survey records for an unrelated contract. An error so precise and so deliberate that she had noted it in her own records as potentially fraudulent, meaning to revisit it when she had time, and then had not yet revisited it. The error was in the boundary deflection angles. The 1879 survey had placed the eastern boundary of the Thatcher Ranch parcel approximately 40 chains further west than the true legal corner. 40 chains was nearly half a mile. It had shrunk the parcel significantly, which had affected its legal assessed value, which had in turn affected the seizure proceedings. Without the correct boundary, the ranch had looked like a smaller, less valuable property than it actually was, which had made it easier to seize under the land company's claimed legal mechanisms. Sallie knew this because she had run the correct calculations herself, off the original government survey monuments, last spring. She had written them in her field notebook and flagged the discrepancy as needing formal attention. That notebook was in her saddlebag. Calloway's letter said that Webb had been paid to make exactly that error. Sallie had spent 6 years learning to read landscape as information. She was now reading a different landscape, one made of legal records and deliberate deceptions, and a system that had destroyed one family and called it lawful process, and it was giving her the same feeling she got when she looked at a survey with a concealed error, the feeling of a wrong line drawn across true ground. "Saddle your horse again," she had said, and now they were riding east toward Elko because the attorney Devereaux was in Elko, and because the county recorder's office in Elko held the 1879 survey plats, and because Sallie had the field notebook with her calculated corrections, and because the truth, the actual, documented, legally provable truth, was sitting in those records waiting for someone competent enough to understand it and stubborn enough to go get it. Cecil rode beside her at a flat-out gallop for the first mile, until they were well clear of Copper Falls, and then she pulled her horse to a steadier pace and he matched her. "You want to tell me what's in that notebook?" he asked. "In 1879, she said, keeping her eyes on the terrain ahead, a surveyor named Harlan Webb resurveyed the Carson Valley parcels in connection with a series of land company acquisition proceedings. His survey was accepted as legal and binding by the county recorder's office in Elko and used as the basis for 7 parcel seizures, including your father's property. Cecil's jaw tightened. I know this part. What you may not know, Sallie said, is that Webb's survey contained a systematic error in the boundary deflection angles on the eastern sides of all 7 parcels. The error shrank each parcel by moving the eastern boundary westward by between 35 and 45 chains. She paused. I identified this error last spring while reviewing historical records for a different contract. I calculated the correct boundary positions off the original government monuments. The correct boundaries place your father's eastern fence line nearly half a mile east of where Webb's fraudulent survey put it. She looked at him directly for a moment, then back at the trail. Your family's ranch, legally surveyed correctly, was not a marginal property. It was one of the largest and most valuable private land holdings in the Carson Valley. The silence between them was the kind that happens when truth lands in a space that has been waiting for it for years. Cecil's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and controlled with what was clearly enormous effort. That's why they wanted it. Yes, and you can prove it with your calculations. With my calculations and the original monuments and the 1879 plat records in the Elko recorder's office, yes, she said, it can be proven. The fraudulent survey can be formally challenged and declared void. And if Calloway's letter identifies Webb as the agent of that fraud and also identifies who ordered it and connects that to the broader scheme that ended with your brother and Marshall Holt, she stopped. Cecil, this is not just about clearing your name. This is about a conspiracy involving land theft, fraud, bribery of public officials, and the false prosecution of a fugitive. If we bring this to the right people in the right order with the right documentation, it unravels, he said. It unravels, she confirmed. He rode in silence for a moment. Then he said, Sallie, why are you doing this? She was quiet for a moment that felt like a carefully considered silence. Because the survey is wrong, she said finally. And a wrong survey is not something I can leave uncorrected. He heard what she wasn't saying. He said nothing about it. But he rode a little closer to her for the rest of that morning, and she did not increase the distance. They made Elko in 2 days, riding hard and camping on the trail, choosing routes that kept them off the main roads and away from populated settlements where Cecil's face might be recognized. They talked through the nights, not always about the case, about other things. His years on the road, the places he had seen, the particular quality of the light over the Ruby Mountains in winter. Her childhood in Sacramento, following her father on survey lines through terrain that most children never saw. The survey work she loved, and the bureaucratic fights she was tired of. The small details of how the world looked to each of them. On the second night, camped in a shallow canyon with the stars thrown across the sky above them and a fire built low and careful between them, Cecil said, When this is over one way or another, what do you want? What does Sallie Rhodes want for herself out of this life? She looked at the fire for a long time. To be allowed to do my work without having to fight for the right to do it at every turn, she said. To have something that is mine. A home. People who are mine. She paused. I have been alone a long time. He did not say what was building in him like a river against a dam. He said, You won't be alone forever. She looked at him across the fire. The amber eyes were level and serious, and held something in them that was not quite the careful professionalism she used as her default armor. No, she said quietly. I don't suppose I will. They arrived in Elko on the morning of the 3rd day after Copper Falls. Sallie left Cecil camped outside of town in a draw thick with cottonwood and willow, well hidden and provisioned, while she rode in alone. She went first to the county recorder's office, where she introduced herself by name and contract number, and requested access to the 1879 survey plats for the Carson Valley parcel block. The clerk, a young man named Horace who had the look of someone who found his job deeply uninteresting, fetched the plats with the minimal possible enthusiasm and left her at a wide table to work. Sallie worked for 4 hours. She spread the 1879 plats against her own field calculations, cross-referenced both against the original 1862 government survey monuments whose coordinates she had in her notebook, and built a documented comparison that was, by the time she was finished, as close to irrefutable as survey mathematics could produce. She wrote her findings in a formal report format, signed and dated it, and requested that Horace stamp it with the recorder's official seal as a received document. Horace looked at the document, looked at her, and asked why she needed it stamped. Because it documents a fraudulent survey that was used in the unlawful seizure of 7 private land parcels, she said pleasantly. Stamp it, please. Horace stamped it. She went next to the office of the attorney Devereux. The office was above a saddle shop on the main street, and the man himself was in his 60s, white-haired and sharp-eyed, with the quality of alertness that long-practicing lawyers sometimes develop, an ability to assess the significance of something before anyone has told them what it is. He assessed Sallie as she came through the door and said, without preamble, "What do you need?" Sallie sat down across from his desk without being invited to. She placed Calloway's letter on the desk between them. "I need you to tell me if you are the Devereux named in this letter," she said, "and if so, what you did with the information it references." Devereux looked at the letter. His face changed in a way that a less observant person might have missed: a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional shift in the set of his mouth. "Where did you get this?" he said. "From the man whose family was destroyed by the events it describes," she said. "A man who has been a fugitive for 3 years on the basis of false witnesses and fraudulent documentation. I have here." She placed the stamped recorder's office report beside the letter. "A formal survey comparison proving that the 1879 Carroll Valley parcel survey used to justify the land seizures was deliberately falsified. I have the calculations, the monument coordinates, and the recorder's stamp." She looked at him steadily. "Now I need to know what else you have." The old lawyer looked at her for a very long moment. Then he looked at the letter. Then he looked at his hands on the desk. "Calloway sent me that letter's twin," he said finally. "His confession, the full one." He paused. "I have been trying to determine what to do with it for 2 years." Sallie did not allow herself to feel the full weight of that yet. "Do you have it here?" "In my safe," he said. "I have had it in my safe since 1881. "Then this is what we are going to do," Sallie said. She stayed in Devereux's office for 3 hours. When she left, she had in her possession a notarized copy of Calloway's full confession, which was 12 pages and named 11 men, including Harlan Webb, the fraudulent surveyor, the former Carson City Land Company director, a county judge who had since retired to California, and 2 witnesses whose testimony at the original seizure proceedings had been purchased, combined with her own documented survey analysis, and a formal affidavit from Devereux attesting to the letter's provenance and his own possession of its twin since Calloway's death. She also had, because she had thought to ask for it, a letter on Devereux's official letterhead addressed to the United States District Court of Nevada, formally requesting a review of the criminal proceedings against one Cecil Thatcher on the grounds of newly documented evidence of systemic fraud. Devereux had written it without much hesitation once he understood the completeness of the package Sallie was assembling. He was, she thought, a man who had been waiting for someone to make the decision he had been unable to make alone. She rode back to the cottonwood draw with the documents in her saddlebag and found Cecil sitting against a cottonwood with his hat over his eyes and his horse grazing nearby. He heard her coming and moved the hat. He looked at her face and sat up straight. "You got something," he said. "I got everything," she said, "or close enough to it that the rest is a matter of legal process." She dismounted and sat down across from him, and spread the documents on the ground between them the way she spread survey plats, pointing to each piece and explaining its significance with the same clarity and directness she brought to explaining measurement data. Cecil listened without interrupting. His face was very still. When she finished, he looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. "Sallie," he said finally, "yes, you went in there alone and built a legal case in 4 hours. It took closer to 7 hours including Devereaux. You built a legal case in 7 hours," he said. "That would have taken a lawyer weeks." "I know what I am looking for when I look at survey documentation," she said, "and Devereaux already had most of the pieces. He just needed someone to walk through the door and put them in order." Cecil looked at her. And in that moment, the thing he had been holding back for 11 days, the careful, responsible silence he had maintained about what she had come to mean to him, became impossible to maintain. Not because the moment was dramatic, because it was not. Because Sallie Rhodes was sitting in the dirt across from him with survey documents spread around her and dust on her coat and her amber eyes clear and direct and utterly, completely herself, and he was looking at her, and he could not find a reason in the world that was good enough for him to go on not saying what was true. "I am in love with you," he said. Sallie went very still. "I don't say that to complicate things," he said. "And I don't say it because of what you just did, though what you just did is," he stopped, found the word, "extraordinary. I say it because it has been true for at least a week and I am tired of not saying it. And if I'm about to walk into a legal process that could end in any number of ways, I would like to have said it at least once." Sallie looked at him for a moment. Then she began putting the documents back into careful order. "You are not walking into a legal process that ends badly," she said. "Not if I have anything to say about it." She straightened the edges of the pages. "And you do not say something like that and then sit there waiting. Come over here." He moved to her side of the fire. She looked up at him, and there was something in her face that was completely different from her professional composure, something warmer and more vulnerable and more honest, the part of Sallie Rhodes that existed beneath the surveyor and the fighter and the woman who never asked for help. "I have been careful my whole life not to want things I couldn't calculate the odds on," she said quietly. "People being an especially poor candidate for that kind of confidence." She paused. "But I have been for about a week in a significant amount of difficulty where you are concerned." He took her hand. It was a simple thing. Her hands were calloused from chainwork and rope and instrument handles, strong and practical, and he held them like they were something worth holding. "What do we do now?" he asked. "Now," she said, "we go to Copper Falls together, and we walk into that sheriff's office together and you give him the documents and I stand next to you and explain what they mean and we let the process work." He looked at their joined hands. "You trust the process." "I trust the evidence," she said. "The evidence is very good." He leaned forward and kissed her. It was the first time, and it was careful and deliberate. The way she did everything, the way he had done nothing in years, and it lasted exactly long enough to be entirely unambiguous. They rode back to Copper Falls the next morning. Sallie had sent a telegraph from Elko before leaving, not to the sheriff of Copper Falls, but to the United States Marshal's office in Carson City, addressed to Marshal Thomas Greer, who had a reputation, among the people who knew such things, for being one of the few federal law officers in Nevada who could not be bought. The telegraph had been brief and professional, and had contained 3 of the 11 names from Calloway's confession. Sallie knew that 3 names would be enough. If Greer was the man she believed him to be, he would move quickly. They arrived in Copper Falls on a Tuesday morning in late September, and found the town already in a state of elevated attention. There were 2 horses tied in front of the sheriff's office that had federal marshal livery. 2 deputies who had been watching the street for the past 3 days snapped to alertness when Sallie and Cecil rode in. Cecil was tense beside her. She could feel it in the way he sat his horse upright and controlled, the posture of a man who had faced down the worst possibilities enough times to know how to look directly at them. "Easy," she said quietly. "I'm easy," he said, which was not entirely true, but she appreciated the effort. They dismounted and tied their horses at the rail in front of the sheriff's office. The door opened before they reached it, and a tall man in a federal marshal's coat stepped out. He was perhaps 50, lean and weathered, with a steady authority that came from decades of difficult decisions. He looked at Cecil Thatcher with the measuring gaze of a man who had looked at a great many wanted notices and then at the actual faces behind them. "You're Thatcher," he said. "I am," Cecil said. "Marshal Greer," the man said. Then he looked at Sallie. "And you'd be the land surveyor." "Sallie Rhodes," she said. "I have documentation for you." She opened her saddlebag and began taking out the carefully organized packet she had assembled. Formal survey analysis proving deliberate falsification of the 1879 Carson Valley survey plats, used to facilitate the unlawful seizure of 7 private land parcels. Notarized full confession from Emmett Calloway, deceased 1881, naming 11 individuals in a coordinated conspiracy involving land fraud, bribery of public officials, and the deliberate false prosecution of Cecil Thatcher following the death of Marshall Holt. She handed him the stack. Affidavit from attorney Harlan Devereaux of Elko, corroborating the confession's provenance. And the letter that Mr. Thatcher has been carrying. Greer took the documents. He looked at the top sheet, then he looked at Sallie. "You put this together," he said. "I identified the fraudulent survey," she said. "The rest was a matter of finding the pieces that were already there and organizing them coherently." "In how long?" 7 hours of active work in Elko, 11 days of background conversation. She paused. "The foundation is solid. I am prepared to testify to the survey analysis under oath." Greer was quiet for a moment. He looked at Cecil again. "You'll come in and make a formal statement." "Yes," Cecil said. "No one's running." "No one's running," Sallie said. The sheriff's office of Copper Falls was a single room with a desk, 3 chairs, a rack of rifles, and a map of Nevada tacked to the wall that had been annotated in 3 different colors of pencil. Cecil and Sallie sat on one side of the desk and Marshal Greer sat on the other. And over the next 4 hours, Cecil told the whole story from the beginning, and Sallie presented the documentary evidence at each relevant point, and Greer asked questions that were precise and fair, and suggested he had already, in the 2 days since receiving her telegraph, done a significant amount of his own investigation. At the end of the 4 hours, Greer set down his pen and looked at the pile of documents on the desk. "I have been looking at Emmett Calloway's name in connection with 3 other cases for the past year," he said. "I could not make anything stick because I could not find the original survey documentation." He looked at Sallie. "Your analysis closes the loop." "The fraudulent survey was the mechanism," Sallie said. "Without it, none of the seizures were legally executable. With it voided, the entire structure of the conspiracy loses its foundation." Greer nodded. He looked at Cecil. "I am not going to arrest you today." Cecil went very still. "I am going to request a formal review of the charges against you from the district court in Reno," Greer said. "On the basis of this documentation, you will need to remain available and accessible for that process, which means no disappearing." "He'll be with me," Sallie said. "I have 4 more survey contracts before winter. I know exactly where we will be for the next 2 months. Greer looked at her, and something that might have been amusement moved briefly through his weathered face. "Is that right?" he said. "It is," she said. Cecil looked at her from the side with the expression of a man who has just been told he has a future. The formal review process took 6 weeks. In that time, Sallie completed her remaining survey contracts, and Cecil rode with her as chain man, as camp hand, as the person who handled the mule when it was being particularly difficult, which was often, and they lived in the same traveling efficiency of the first 11 days, but now with the added dimension of knowing what they were to each other. It was different in the best way. It was the same practical, collaborative rhythm, but warmer now, and punctuated by the kind of small intimacies that develop between people who are falling into each other with both feet, the instinctive awareness of the other's position across a survey line, the way he brought her coffee in the morning before she had asked, the way she showed him how to read a compass bearing, and he learned it in one lesson and was quietly pleased about it. He told her more of his history. She told him more of hers. There was a great deal to tell on both sides, And they were not in a hurry. They had, for the first time in a long time, the sensation of people who believed they had enough time ahead of them for all the conversations they needed to have. The review finding came in November, delivered to Sallie's address at the land office in Carson City. It was official, formal, and unambiguous. All charges against Cecil Thatcher were dismissed on the basis of documented fraud in the original proceedings, false witness testimony secured through bribery, and newly established evidence that placed the death of Marshall Holt on a different individual whose own death in 1880 had already been recorded. 4 of the 11 men named in Calloway's confession faced separate charges. Harlan Webb had already fled Nevada, but warrants were issued. The former land company director settled the civil portion of the case with a payment that was to be distributed among the 7 families whose land had been unlawfully seized. The retired judge in California was facing a separate proceeding in the federal court. Cecil's brother Jesse was officially cleared posthumously. His name was removed from the wanted records. It was a small justice for someone who was no longer there to receive it, but it was not nothing. The ranch in the Carson Valley was gone sold 3 times over in the 6 years since the seizure, the buildings altered, the land divided. Cecil could not recover it as it had been, but as part of the civil settlement, he received compensation equal to a fair market valuation of the parcel as surveyed correctly, which was, thanks to Sallie's precise calculation of the actual boundary, considerably more than anyone had anticipated. When they received the letter, they were camped in a canyon south of Virginia City, a small fire, the stars above them, Sallie's theodolite in its case and her field notebook stacked neatly by her saddlebag. Cecil read the letter twice, then he set it down and looked at the fire for a long time. "It's done," he said. "It's done," Sallie agreed. He looked at her. She was watching him with the careful, full attention she gave to the things that mattered to her, and there was in her amber eyes the soft, steady warmth that he had come to think of as the most beautiful thing he had ever been the recipient of in his life. "I want to build something," he said. "A ranch. Somewhere with water and decent grass. I know how to raise cattle. I did it for the first 20 years of my life." He paused. He stopped, and then, because he was a man who had learned the hard way not to leave important things unsaid, "I want to build it with you, if that is something you would consider." Sallie looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "A ranch needs accurate boundary surveys. I was rather counting on having the best land surveyor in Nevada available to do that." "She would need to keep her government contracts," Sallie said. "She has a career she intends to continue." "Naturally. And her surveying equipment takes precedence in terms of wagon space," she said. "The theodolite is fragile." "The theodolite gets its own compartment," Cecil said solemnly. Sallie's face broke into the sudden, real, luminous smile that he had been storing up like a man saving money against hard winters. "Yes," she said. "Yes, the theodolite gets its own compartment, or yes, you'll build a ranch with me." "Yes to both," she said. "Obviously." He moved around the fire to her side, and she leaned against him with the comfortable ease of someone who had made a decision she was entirely certain about. And they sat together under the November stars of the Nevada desert and talked about land, what kind, what aspect, how much water, how close to a town with a telegraph office, with the specific, detailed practicality of 2 people who are, at their cores, people who take practical things seriously, and who have discovered that love, when it is built on that foundation, is one of the most practical decisions a person can make. They were married in Carson City in January of 1884, in a small ceremony attended by Marshall Greer, Attorney Devereaux, and 2 women from the Nevada Land Office, who had been among Sallie's few consistent professional allies over the years. The ceremony was performed by a judge who had known Sallie's father, a fact she had not expected, and that moved her more than she showed, though Cecil, who was standing beside her, noticed the slight brightness in her eyes and pressed her hand once, quietly. They found their land in the spring. A valley in northern Nevada, east of the Ruby Mountains, with a good creek running through it and bunch grass on the flats, and enough elevation on the south-facing slopes to make decent hay ground. Sallie surveyed the boundary herself, establishing the corners from the government monuments with a precision that would stand unchallenged in any court for a generation. Cecil built the house with his own hands, starting in April and finishing the main structure by July. He had grown up around ranch building, and he remembered the specific satisfaction of it. The way a well-made thing announced itself through the simple fact of standing correctly. He built it solid and functional, with a wide porch on the south side and a room at the back that had good north light and a sturdy work table, which was Sallie's office. She kept her government contracts through the following years. She was away sometimes for weeks at a time, working survey projects across the northern part of the state, and Cecil ran the ranch in her absence with the competent, unhurried efficiency of a man who had been taking care of himself for a very long time. When she came home, she came back to a place that was genuinely hers, the house smelling of wood smoke and coffee and the particular dust of the valley, and Cecil at the door with the look of a man for whom the word home had been completely redefined. Their first child was a boy. They named him James after Cecil's father. He arrived in the spring of 1885, a loud and emphatic infant who announced himself with considerable enthusiasm, and grew into a boy who followed his mother around survey camps with an attention that she recognized as the same precise, detail-oriented focus she had brought to her father's work at the same age. Their second child was a girl born in 1887, who they named Margaret for Sallie's mother. Margaret was a different creature from her brother, quieter, more observant, with her father's steady patience and a stubbornness in her that was entirely from both sides. The valley they had built in became home in the fullest sense. Not the dramatic, mythologized home of the stories people told about the West, not something swept and iconic, but the real kind, the kind made of accumulated ordinary mornings and seasons that came and went and accumulated into something that looked, from the right angle, like a life that had been built on purpose. Sallie continued to survey. She took James with her on shorter contracts as he grew older, showing him the theodolite with the same patient instruction her father had given her, watching him develop the same instinct for precise measurement and the same affection for the landscape as information. By the time he was 12, he could run a survey chain correctly and read a compass bearing, and by 15, he was helping her with calculations in the field with an accuracy that made her quietly, enormously proud. Cecil built the ranch into something real, not large by the standards of the great cattle operations, but solid and well-managed, with enough cattle to support the family comfortably and enough land, properly surveyed and clearly documented, that no one would ever challenge the boundaries. He had his own private satisfaction in that, in the fact that the land his family stood on was documented with an accuracy that could never be used against them, that the line on the ground was true. In the fall of 1889, a young man from the land office in Carson City came to visit. He was perhaps 22, formally credentialed but inexperienced, and he was working on a contested survey case in the eastern part of the state that had become complicated beyond his ability to resolve. He had been directed to Sallie Rhodes Thatcher as the person most likely to be able to help him understand what he was looking at. Sallie sat with him at her work table for 2 days and walked him through the analysis of the fraudulent survey documents he had brought, showing him, the same way she had walked Marshall Greer through the Callaway case, how to read the error, how to calculate the correct position, how to build a documented case that would survive formal challenge. On the second evening after the young man had left, Cecil came into the office with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat across the work table. "You spent 2 days teaching that young man to do your job," he said. Sallie looked up from the notes she was making. "He needed to be able to do it himself," she said. "You know what I think. Tell me." "I think you should write it down," he said. "A proper survey methodology guide for practitioners in Nevada and further." What you know, the way you read documents, the way you identify fraudulent measurements, your approach to terrain, that's not something every land surveyor in the territory is going to learn on their own. But they could learn it from a written guide. Sallie looked at him for a moment. The amber eyes held a consideration that was also, unmistakably, gratitude, not just for the idea, which was good, but for the quality of attention it represented, for the fact that he had been paying that close attention for 6 years. That would take a significant amount of time to do properly, she said. You have the winters, he said, and the nights when you're not in the field. You'd have to be patient while I'm writing rather than, Sallie, he said. I built you that office specifically so you could do things that require quiet. I'll be very patient. She reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers, the way she sometimes did, with the same sureness and deliberateness that she brought to setting up an instrument station, like something she was doing on purpose and without reservation. You are the best man I have ever met, she said. You're the only woman who ever looked at a $900 wanted notice on me and saw a negotiating opportunity, he said. I think we are well matched. She laughed, that real, sudden laugh that still made his chest do the same thing it had done the first time he heard it in the Nevada desert in 1883. We are, she said. We are very well matched. She began writing the guide that winter. It took 3 years to complete, she was thorough, and she was not willing to publish something she could not stand behind completely. And when it was done, it was a document of 300 pages covering land surveying methodology, fraud identification, legal documentation standards, and the application of survey mathematics to contested boundary cases. She submitted it to the Nevada State Land Office in 1892, where it was formally adopted as a reference document for state surveyors. It was the first such guide authored by a woman in the state's history, and the land office director noted as much in his letter of acceptance, which she kept in the drawer of her work table. Cecil read every word of it and told her at the end that it was extraordinary. She believed him, not because he said it, but because she knew by that point with absolute certainty that Cecil Thatcher did not say things he did not mean. The winter of 1893 brought heavy snow to the Ruby Mountain Valley, and they spent the evenings by the fire with James, who was 8 years old and asked questions about everything, and Margaret, who was 6 and had recently decided that her primary interest was horses, which meant she spent most of her available hours in the barn with a patience and focus that Cecil recognized as identical to her mother's. On one of those evenings when the children were asleep and the fire had burned low and the snow was pressing gently against the windows, Cecil said, out of a comfortable silence, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Sallie was darning a sock and did not look up. "Tell me." "The morning I handed you that letter in Copper Falls," he said, "I thought I was handing you a piece of paper that would explain why I had lived the way I had and ask you to believe it, and then I was going to walk away and give myself up to whatever came next." He paused. "I thought that was the end of something. I had no idea it was the beginning." Sallie set down the sock. She looked at him across the firelight, this man who had come to her as a wounded fugitive under a juniper tree and who was now the center of the life she had never quite dared to fully want. "The letter said the truth," she said, "and the truth was worth going after." "You went after it for me," he said. "I went after it because it was wrong and I could fix it," she said. "You just happened to be the reason it needed fixing." But she was smiling when she said it, the small, warm smile that was only for him, that was not the professional composure or the quiet confidence she wore in public, but the private face of Sallie Rhodes Thatcher, who had built this life by choice and with her whole self. "I love you," he said. He said it still with the same deliberateness he had said it the first time, in the cottonwood draw outside Elko, because he had learned from years of not saying important things that important things were worth the full weight of the words. "I love you," she said, the same way. They sat by the fire while the snow fell outside and the children slept, and the land around them lay under winter, in the specific piece of a valley that had been properly and permanently mapped by the most precise pair of hands in Nevada, with corners established in true ground and documented in records that could not be moved or falsified or used against anyone. Not now, not ever. In the spring of 1894, when the creek was running high and the grass was coming in, and Margaret had persuaded her father to let her help with the early season cattle work from the back of a very patient old horse named Solomon, Sallie came to find Cecil in the south pasture where he was checking fence line, and stood at the fence rail watching him for a moment before he noticed her. He walked back to her. He looked at her face and understood immediately, without being told, the specific quality of the news she was carrying. "Again," he said. "Again," she said. He put his arms around her there at the fence in the spring morning, with the Ruby Mountains sharp and white above the valley and the creek sound coming up from the lower meadow, and Solomon ambling around the far end of the pasture with Margaret on his back, looking enormously pleased with herself. "What do you want?" he asked into her hair. "I want it to be healthy," she said. "The rest I'm flexible about. And if it's a boy," he said, "I think we should name him after your father." She pulled back enough to look at him. "Thomas, Thomas," he confirmed, "after the man who taught you how to read the world with precision and honesty and care, the man whose work you finished and then exceeded." He paused. "I think that's worth naming someone after." Sallie looked at him for a moment with the full weight of everything she felt, which was considerable, and which she had long since stopped trying to manage or moderate around this man because it was unnecessary and inefficient, and he deserved all of it. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." The baby arrived in October of 1894, loud and healthy and emphatically a boy, who they named Thomas as agreed, and who arrived with a shock of dark hair, and the kind of determined expression that suggested he had opinions about things, and intended to express them clearly. James, now 9, regarded his new brother with the evaluative seriousness of someone who intended to make sure the new arrival was brought up correctly. Margaret, 7, promptly declared that Thomas was hers in some proprietary fashion that no one quite had the heart to argue with. Cecil stood at the doorway of the bedroom where Sallie lay with the new baby, and looked at the scene with the feeling of a man who has been given more than he had any right to expect from the world, and who is fully aware of that fact. "You know," he said, 11 years ago I handed a piece of paper to a woman I had known for 10 days and asked her to read it." Sallie looked up at him from the pillow, tired and brilliant and entirely herself. "And I read it and rode with you instead of letting you go," she said. "Best decision either of us ever made," he said. "Second best," she said. "What was the first?" "The mule," she said. "If my mule hadn't been so obstinate about the terrain that the wheel cracked on that particular stretch of the Humboldt Sink, I would never have stopped where you were camped." She looked at the baby and then at him. "So technically, we owe all of this to a very difficult mule." Cecil laughed, the deep, real laugh that she had first heard in the Nevada desert, and that had not diminished in 11 years of daily use. "I'll put him in the will," he said. "The mule is dead," she said. "I'll put the memory of him in the will." "Come here," she said, and he came and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the child in her arms and at the window where the October light of the Ruby Mountain Valley was falling gold and long across the floor, and at all of it, the whole accumulated particular truth of the life she had surveyed and built and documented and inhabited with both hands. The boundary lines of this life were true. She had measured them herself. They would hold.